The year is 1715, and the Sun King, Louis XIV, lies dead in the royal crypt at Saint-Denis. But he has left behind a legacy far heavier than the marble of his tomb. 3 billion livres of sovereign debt. France, the jewel of Europe, is financially hollowed out, a starving giant adorned in rotting velvet. The treasury is empty, the peasantry is crushed, and the coin of the realm has been debased so frequently that gold has vanished into hordes, terrified of the light. Into this vacuum steps a man who is neither French nor a banker by trade. He is a Scot, a fugitive, a convicted murderer, and a genius of probability who sees the world not as a collection of tangible objects, but as a fluid equation of risk and reward. John Law does not bring gold to Paris. He brings an idea, a dangerous, intoxicating belief that money is not metal, but confidence. Now, let us open the archives and dissect the anatomy of this failure. To understand the Mississippi mirage, we must first understand the desperation of the patient. The Duke of Orleans, acting as regent for the child king Louis XV, presided over a bankrupt state. The traditional remedies, taxation and austerity, were political suicide. The crown was drowning, weighed down by the heavy anchor of its own leverage, gasping for liquidity. It was in this climate of suffocating insolvency that John Law presented his system. His proposition was elegant, seductive, and fundamentally alchemical. He would replace the scarcity of gold with the abundance of paper. Law established the Banque Générale, the first entity in France to issue paper banknotes. Unlike the unpredictable metal currency, Law's notes were promised to be stable, backed by the authority of the king. It was a masterstroke of psychological engineering. For a brief moment, the blood began to flow back into the veins of the French economy. Trade revived. Taxes were paid. The regent, intoxicated by this miraculous recovery, gave Law the keys to the kingdom. But paper requires a backing of faith, and faith requires a temple. Law built his upon the muddy, fever-ridden banks of a distant colony, Louisiana. In 1717, Law acquired the Compagnie d'Occident, later known as the Mississippi Company. He was granted a monopoly on trade with the French territories in the Americas. To the average Parisian, Louisiana was a terra incognita, a blank canvas upon which fantasies could be painted. Law, ever the mathematician of human desire, understood that he was not selling land. He was selling a dream of infinite yield. He launched what we might identify today as the world's first mass media marketing campaign. The archives contain the evidence of this fabrication engravings, commissioned by the company, depicting Louisiana not as the mosquito-infested swamp it was, but as a Garden of Eden. These illustrations showed mountains of emeralds, friendly natives offering gold ingots to French settlers, and fertile soil that required no labor. It was a mirage of aggressive optimism. Law coordinated the finding of gold deposits that did not exist and paraded wealthy returnees through the streets of Paris, actors dressed in fine silks, claiming to have made their fortunes across the Atlantic. The strategy was a feedback loop of brilliance and deceit. Law used the bank to print money. The public used the money to buy shares in the Mississippi Company. The company used the capital to absorb the king's debt. It seemed like a perpetual motion machine of prosperity. The share price began to climb. not based on the arrival of trade ships or the harvesting of crops, but on the sheer hydraulic pressure of printed money chasing a limited number of shares. Law had achieved the impossible. He had severed the link between value and reality. In the salons of Paris, the skepticism of the old nobility began to melt away, replaced by a ravenous hunger. They looked at the paper notes in their hands and saw freedom from the past. They did not see the ink still wet on the page, nor did they smell the rot of the bayou beneath the perfume of the securities.
Can you hear the crowd cheering?
The illusion was complete.
They must see us above
The ascent had begun. And like Icarus, France was now flying toward a sun made entirely of paper. If the Royal Bank was the engine of this new economy, the Rue Quincampoix was its combustion chamber. It is difficult for the modern mind, accustomed to the silent, digital transmission of billions in capital, to visualize the sheer physical density of the Mississippi Mania. The Rue Quincampoix was not a grand boulevard designed for commerce. It was a narrow, suffocating artery in the heart of Paris, barely 20 feet wide. Yet, in the fevered months of late 1719, it became the center of the financial universe. Here, the strict caste system of the Ancien Régime, a hierarchy calcified over centuries, dissolved in a solvent of pure greed. The archives describe a chaotic democracy of speculation. Dukes rubbed shoulders with footmen, bishops traded tips with prostitutes, generals bartered with shopkeepers. The social order collapsed because the promise of the Mississippi Company made the old currency of status irrelevant. Why bow to a lord when a chimney sweep could purchase a title with a handful of paper shares? The scene was one of hysterical friction. Real estate on the street became so valuable that nearby houses were leased for exorbitant sums merely to provide a window from which to shout orders. A famous anecdote from the period tells of a hunchback who made a small fortune simply by renting out his back as a writing desk for desperate speculators to sign contracts upon. This is not merely a colorful detail, it is a diagnosis. When the human body is commodified as office furniture, we are witnessing a market that has detached itself from dignity and reason. John Law, now the most powerful man in France, watched as his creation took on a life of its own. The share price of the Mississippi Company did not just rise, it mutated. Issued at 500 livres, the shares breached 1,000, then 5,000, and by the winter of 1719, they touched the dizzying height of 10,000 livres. This was the birth of the term millionaire, a word coined specifically to describe the Mississippians, the rough-handed commoners who suddenly possessed wealth that rivaled the crown itself. But beneath the velvet coats of these new millionaires, the fundamental mechanics of the economy were beginning to grind. Law was trapped in a cycle of his own making. To sustain the soaring share price, he had to increase the money supply. He ran the printing presses of the Banque Royale hot, churning out paper notes to ensure there was enough liquidity for the frenzy to continue. It was a strategy of quantitative easing 3 centuries before the term existed, but it lacked the safety valves of modern central banking. The resulting inflation was aggressive and tangible. The price of bread, cloth, and fuel skyrocketed. The illusion of wealth was pervasive, yet the reality of purchasing power was evaporating. Paris was awash in money, yet the people were beginning to starve. The gilded cage was closing in. The newly rich found that their paper millions could buy everything except certainty. The crack in the facade did not appear in the swamp of Louisiana, but in the drawing rooms of the elite. The smart money, the cynics, the seasoned courtiers, and the rivals of law began to sense the disconnect.
We must hurry.
They looked at the valuation of the company, which exceeded the entire estimated wealth of France, and then they looked at the returns from the colonies, a few shipments of furs and tobacco. The math did not reconcile. The company was a colossus of paper standing on feet of clay. The first major tremor occurred when the Prince of Conti, a man of immense influence and petty grudges, decided to test the system. Driven by a personal slight from law and a shrewd instinct for survival, the prince sent 3 wagons to the Banque Royale. He did not want paper. He demanded the conversion of his enormous holdings into gold and silver. It was a bank run of 1. Law was horrified. The entire system was predicated on the belief that paper was better than gold. If the nobility began to cash out, the psychological dam would break. Law appealed to the regent, and the gold was returned, but the damage was done. The signal had been sent. The paper was a promise that could not be kept if everyone asked for the truth at the same time. In a desperate bid to save his creation, Law pivoted from financier to tyrant. He convinced the regent to pass a series of draconian edicts. The ownership of gold and silver coin was outlawed. It became illegal to hold more than 500 livres in metal. Private homes were raided. Servants were bribed to inform on their masters. The invisible hand of the market was replaced by the iron fist of the state. This was the moment the fever turned into a delirium. The citizens of France were forced to use the very currency they were beginning to doubt. They were trapped in a burning building with the exit sealed. The share price hovered at its zenith, suspended not by confidence, but by coercion. Law, the gambler who believed he could tame chance, had committed the ultimate sin of the statistician. He believed he could dictate the outcome. He had consolidated the debt, the bank, the trade, and the currency into a single, monolithic entity. He had created a system with no redundancy, where a single point of failure would not just cause a recession, but a total systemic collapse. The crowds on Rue Quincampoix still shouted for shares, but the tone had shifted. It was no longer the joyous clamor of discovery. It was the frantic, high-pitched screaming of a mob that realizes, subconsciously, that the music is about to stop. They were buying not because they believed in the future of Louisiana, but because they were terrified of the present in Paris. The bubble had stretched to its absolute physical limit, holding its shape only through the surface tension of terror. The end did not come with a bang, but with a decree. In May 1720, faced with the undeniable reality that the volume of paper currency vastly exceeded the value of all metal in the kingdom, John Law made a fatal miscalculation. He attempted a controlled deflation. He announced that the value of the shares in the banknotes would be gradually devalued by half over the coming months to align with reality. It was a moment of intellectual honesty in a system built on fantasy, and it was devastating. The public did not see a responsible economic adjustment. They saw a confession of bankruptcy. The psychological anchor snapped. The panic that ensued was absolute. The Rue Quincampoix, once a carnival of greed, transformed instantly into a scene of violent despair. The smart money had already exited, leaving the vast majority of the population holding the bag. The crowds that now besieged the Banque Royale were not looking to buy. They were desperate to sell, to salvage anything tangible from the wreckage of their fortunes. The crush was so intense that on a single day in July, 15 people were trampled to death at the gates of the bank. Their bodies were carried through the streets by the mob to the Palais Royal, a gruesome protest laid at the feet of the regent. The dream of the Mississippi had dissolved into blood and mud on the cobblestones of Paris. John Law, the architect of this ruin, was no longer the savior of France. He was the most hated man in Europe. His carriage was stoned. His house was surrounded. The man who had owned half of France was forced to flee the country under the cover of darkness, disguised as a commoner, leaving his vast estates and his wife behind. He would die years later in Venice, poor and forgotten, a gambler who had finally played one hand too many. The aftermath was a landscape of devastation. Thousands of families were destitute. Suicide spiked across the capital. The trust in the financial system was obliterated, so much so that the French word for bank, banque, became a taboo, replaced for nearly a century by the euphemism case. The monarchy, having defaulted on its moral contract with the people, sowed the first seeds of resentment that would, 70 years later, bloom into the guillotine of the Revolution. Now, let us open the archives and examine the true cost of power. The Mississippi bubble was not merely a financial error. It was a profound psychological event. It revealed that value is a shared hallucination. When we peel back the layers of a stock ticker or a banknote, we find nothing but a promise that relies entirely on the stability of the promisor. John Law proved that a government can print money, but it cannot print trust. We look back at the Mississippians with a sense of superiority, mocking their belief in a swamp they had never seen. Yet, we must ask ourselves, are we so different? Every time a market decouples from reality, every time we buy an asset simply because it is going up, every time we mistake leverage for genius, we are walking down our own Rue Quincampoix. We are all susceptible to the Mississippi mirage, because the seduction is not in the asset itself, but in the belief that we have found a shortcut through the hard laws of economics. The lesson of 1720 is that gravity always wins. The swamp eventually reveals itself. The paper burns, and the debt always remains. Because in the ledger of history, every debt must eventually be paid.